for all of this and to our speakers. She's going to introduce them and hope this ends up to be a helpful session for you. So take it away, Beverly.
Great. Thank you, Alice. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this Grantsmanship workshop today on navigating the NIH funding landscape. As we're getting started, if you notice in the chat, we're asking everyone to drop in some introductory information about yourself. Tell us what department you're with, and what your role is in that department, if you're on faculty, if you're staff, if you're a student. And then let us know also a little bit about your experience with NIH grants. It's fine if you have absolutely no experience. That's who we're targeting for this workshop, or if you have minimal experience. And some of you may have a little bit more experience. So please just let us know about yourself, since we won't have time to go around and do introductions for everyone today. I do want to introduce our two presenters, our two trainers today. We have Doctors David Carroll and Samantha Schwartz, who are both working at NC Tracks. And Isabel Liu, our communication specialist, is going to drop a link in the chat about NC Tracks in case you're not familiar with that resource here on campus. And I encourage you to explore more about tracks if you don't know about them. David is the Director of Research Funding Development at NC Tracks, and Samantha is newer to Tracks as a science grant writer. And we are delighted that they have joined us today to share their wisdom and expertise about how to work through the NIH systems. And we realize that things may be changing at NIH, but I think there will be a wealth of knowledge that they can share with us today. And I will let them introduce themselves more throughout the session today. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping matters. One, we are recording the session. We ask you to stay muted unless you want to speak. And we do want this to be a very interactive session. So if you do have questions, raise your hand in the middle of the session or drop a message in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat. If you don't have a real pressing question in the middle while they're speaking, then we will address questions collectively at the end of each module. There's 2 modules. David will do one and Samantha will lead the other. After the session, I'm going to send out a very brief Qualtrics survey with an set of evaluation questions that I'd love to get your feedback on about the session. And I also just want to recognize other HPDP staff who are involved in this session. Isabel Liu, who is our communications specialist, who will be handling any sort of AV technical needs. And Christina Rodriguez, who is our Associate Director of Grants and Finance, who will be monitoring the chat for us. And she may be chiming in, as she also has lots and lots of experience with NIH grant submissions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David and Samantha.
Okay, thank you. We'll, as Beverly said, we're going to run 2 sessions. 2 modules. I'm going to do the first one and Sam will do the second. And the first is more a big picture of NIH and how the process works and what happens to your grant application when you sort of fling it into the great maw of NIH. And the reason I do this is because I think it's important to understand how the NIH process works. I remember when I wrote my first R01 25 or a long time ago, and my supervisor at the time said, Dave, let's write an R01, which basically meant, Dave, write me an R01. And it took me 6 months. I had no idea what I was doing because at the time there was no online instruction. Everything was a paper instruction book. And I really had only a hazy idea of what NIH was. So I think it's important to be a more educated consumer of NIH services and dollars and to understand how the process works so you're better able to write your grant applications. So let me just fire up the slides and hopefully they will work. Okay, let me go to the start. That would help. Are we all seeing the correct slide?
Looks good.
Great, thank you. So I call this strategic grantsmanship, and this is basically what to do before you start writing and before you start planning your grant, just as opposed to actual grantsmanship, which is what Sam will discuss for the second module. So we're going to cover these areas, and bear in mind this is a half an hour to 45-minute module, so it's an overview more than anything else. There's an awful lot of detail we could go into, and I understand that for some of you this will be old hat, but I'm hoping that there will be, you'll have questions, something will come up that you don't know, having gone through this, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone here, and for those of you who haven't written grants yet, then I hope this will be informative. So we'll talk a bit about the structure of NIH, the different offices and centers and institutions. We'll talk a bit about how grants go through the system, study sections, how to identify a study section. We'll talk a bit about some of the individuals who will interact directly with your grant application. We'll look at a few different mechanisms that are available to you depending on your career stage, and we'll talk a bit about how to find funding sources. If you're in the process, you have a project, you have an idea, how do you go about finding an NIH funding mechanism that's suitable for your work? And then we'll look at the funding announcements themselves. So let's see. So the first thing is, although we talk about NIH and we talk about National Institutes of Health, the important thing to remember is that it is institutes, plural. So this is a list. Obviously, you don't have to memorize anything, but this is a list of all of the institutes and centers and offices that comprise NIH. As you see, there's a whole stack of them. And the thing to remember is they are all different. They all share a common grant submission process, and all grants ultimately end up in one place first. But each institute, and there's about 27 or 28 of them, they're all individual. They all have their own hierarchy, their own directors. They all treat grants and projects a little differently. They all have their own budgets and appropriations, and so therefore they all have their own individual pay lines, which vary from year to year. So they have to take into account the appropriations that they've got from Congress. They have to take into account their existing commitments. So even though they have X amount of money, they have already committed to X number of grants over years. So they have to account for those. And only then can they decide how many grants they can fund. And so that determines, they use that to determine the pay line, which is essentially the percentile score that a grant has to achieve in order to be in the running for funding. They have different policies when it comes to new investigators or early stage investigators. Some give new investigators a pay line bump, some don't, some give more or less. It's very much institute specific. They all have their own advisory councils, their own program officers, and they also differ in how they participate in different parent funding announcements. So, for example, only about half of all institutes will accept an investigator-initiated R21, for example, and only about a third will accept an R03. They will accept these grants if they ask for them, but for example, for NCI, you can't just think, I have a great idea, I'll write an R21 and send it in, because they won't accept it. But if they ask for an R21 on a specific topic, that's different. So they're all very different. So as you think of NIH, think not of the great monolith that NIH is, and think more in terms of individual institutes or centers, but the ones that are particularly relevant to your own line of research. So this is what happens to your grants. Every year, about 90,000 grant applications land at NIH, and they all turn up at the Center for Scientific Review, which is one of the institutes, and this is the institute that is involved with trafficking all of these to the right place. About 75% of these are investigator initiated. Someone had an idea, they wrote a grant, they sent it in, and that's fine. These get sorted through a couple of rounds of sorting based on their topic matter, and this is largely automated based on the keywords in the abstract and the like. So although there is some human interaction, to a large extent, how you write your abstract will determine to an extent where they go. These then end up in study sections. These are the basic review modules, and we'll look a bit more at these in another slide. About 25% of applications are in response to specific requests for grants covering a certain topic matter. So in this 25%, there'll be program grants, there'll be cooperative agreements, training grants, Ks, career development awards, fellowships, contracts, and these generally go to what are called special emphasis panels. So these are essentially a study section, but they're convened for a specific purpose, whereas study sections are usually standing. They last for, they go on through 3 cycles every year, ongoing, although the members rotate in and out. Special emphasis panels are essentially ad hoc study sections, and they're brought together for a specific purpose. The other thing to remember about the review process is it's a 2-stage review process. We all, I won't say obsess, but we concentrate on the scientific review, what happens in the study section. But remember, this is only part of the review. So your grant comes in, it goes to CSR. Some applications are weeded out. Usually these are ones that have some that are non-responsive, or they have some egregious flouting of the rules, be it things like including an appendix that they're not supposed to include and things like that. And these are administratively withdrawn. The rest then go to preliminary review. So they're sent out to 3 or 4 preliminary reviewers, and based on their score, then some number will be triaged, as it's known. They're not discussed. They don't go to study section. And depending on the study section, this could be 50%, it could be 60%. So it depends again. And so a number are discussed in study section. They're given a final score, and then these scores are is one of the factors that is used to determine whether the grants will be funded or not. So the study section does not make funding decisions. They simply review the scientific merit of the work, and then this goes to the IC director, the program officers, and other people, and then this goes to the advisory council, and it's there that they decide on whether they want to fund this. Because remember that even if the work is fantastic, if it doesn't align with the goals of that institute, then they may not want to fund it, even if they think the science is great. It's just not maybe a science that they're interested in funding. So there are 2 stages that it has to get through, and the study section scientific review is just one factor. So your study section, as I said, it's your basic review unit. Could be 20 to 25 people. There's a chairman, there's a scientific review officer who essentially convenes the study section, identifies suitable reviewers, takes notes, and ultimately creates the report that goes back to the review that goes back to the applicant. So there are a number of standing study sections that are administered by the CSR itself, and then there are also institute-specific study sections. And you have some mechanism to identify a study section that's suitable for you. And when you get these slides, these 2 links will open up the individual study sections, both in terms of their topic matter, in terms of their roster and everything else. So you can see who's in a study section, and you can see what that study section is interested in reviewing. So why does it matter that you pick a study section? Well, the first thing is there are 20,000 reviewers at NIH. It's far better if you know that your grant is going to be reviewed by 20 of them rather than an anonymous 20,000. So it's a case of knowing your audience. You can identify whether this study section is suitable for your topic matter. You can look at your study section roster and decide, are there people there who you think, and this is only an educated guess, who you think are most likely to review your applications. So, for example, my wife is a chlamydiologist. So if she puts a grant in and there's a chlamydiologist on the study section, and it's a pretty niche field, she knows that that's at least one reviewer that she's going to have to deal with. So you can sometimes get a sense of who's going to be reading your grant. It is a guess. Nevertheless, it's better to be able to pitch it to 20 people than 20,000 people. You can cite their work. It does no harm if you have two references and you want to cite one that was written by one of your reviewers. Why not? Because it won't do you any harm, and it might, puff them up a bit. You can also identify potential conflicts. This can be an issue if there's someone on a study section who either is in direct competition or plain doesn't like you. You can at least be forewarned. So it's useful to have identified a study section that you think your work should go to, and as I said, you have some facility here. You can choose a study section with this form, the assignment request form, where you can request a specific study section. It has to be a reasonable request, but you can pick who you'd like to review your application, and to a large degree, your request will be honored. In terms of identifying the study section, there's a number of ways of doing that. Through those links on the last slide, you can look at the rosters, you can look at the topic matter. So you can just go through those and find best forum for your work as you see it. What makes a good study section? Well, a good rule of thumb is if you look at the roster and if you don't recognize anyone on it, then that may not be the study section for your work. Conversely, if you look at it and you see 3 or 4 people whose names you recognize because of papers you've read or whatever, then you're in the ballpark in terms of the right group to look at what you're proposing. You can also talk to your program officer, and I'll say no more about that because Sam is going to talk about that. You can also look through Reporter, and we'll look at NIH Reporter in a minute, where you can look at past funding and you can see what study sections looked at work that was similar to yours. So there's a number of ways you can identify a study section, or at least narrow it down, and then request that study section as the best forum for the work that you're presenting. So the advisory council, this is the second half of the review process. Each institute or center has its own advisory council. This is a group made up of researchers, community representatives, and the like. And this group meets 3 times a year. It's usually synced with the standard submission date, which for R01s is early February, early June, early October. And this group, they meet, and these are the group that ultimately decide who gets funded. Now, to a large extent, they take recommendations from the director of the institute, who takes recommendations from program officers and other personnel. But at the end of the day, it's the advisory council who makes the recommendation. And they consider a number of things, including whether it's a good fit for the institute's mission, if there's any issues with the review. So, for example, applicant may get their review back and they object strenuously to something that one of the reviewers said, or they think it was poorly reviewed. The advisory council will look at that. They'll look at very large grants. They'll look at issues of regulatory things like IACUC, animal or human subjects protection. And they will also consider new directions for the institute or center, and we'll look at that in a minute as well. So these are the people. So it's only after this group meets and decides which ones are going to be funded, or recommend which ones are going to be funded, does a funding decision come down. So that's why it could be 10 months or a year after you submit your grant before you finally get the word that you're going to be funded, even though you got your review months and months ahead of that. The 2 people to be concerned about are the program officer and the SRO, the scientific review officer. Program officers are generally former researchers. They're now working for a specific institute. These are the people who write the actual funding announcements. So they're, as previous researchers, they generally advocate for a particular interest or a particular area of research, and they oversee portfolios of grants that are responsive to the funding announcements that they generate. The scientific review officer is the person who runs the study section. Usually, or quite often, a former researcher as well. So they have scientific experience and research experience. These are the people who, using that experience, they're assigned to a study section. They identify the reviewers. They have the thankless task of reaching out and recruiting reviewers. They oversee the review process. They prepare the summary statements. And while they technically run the review, the study section, they're separate from the chair of the study section. Sometimes the program officer will sit in on a study section, but they have to sit on their hands. They're not allowed to take part in the discussion. They can observe, which is useful because after you get your reviews, first thing you might want to do is talk to your program officer and say, what does all this mean? So this is a graphic of the general trajectory of what happens to your grant as it goes in with the time frames. So your grant goes in on whatever the submission date is. Within a couple of weeks, you'll get a study section assignment. And these are usually, once upon a time, these are emailed to you. I think now they generally just go into your ERA Commons account and there you get an email saying there is something new in your ERA Commons account, go and look. So you'll get a study section assignment. If it's a study section you like, great. If it isn't, you get a chance to contact the SRO and say, can we, and explain why and justify why you'd like a different study section. During the 2 to 3 month period when nothing's much happening at your end, the SRO is busy assigning reviewers to applications and the like. What I want to show here is who you can talk to at these various periods of time. You can talk to your PO about your grant application right up until the minute you submit it. And at that point, the PO is no longer part of that discussion. You can talk to them about other grants, but for the grant you just submitted, they're out of the picture for now. The SRO then is the person to contact because now your grant is in the system and they're the only person to deal with. So about 2 to 3 months after your grant goes in, you've got a study section assignment. You're happy. You're sitting around waiting. You will get an email from the SRO saying, please submit any supplemental data or supplemental information by this date, which is usually about a month before the study section meets. And once upon a time, this used to be new data. Now you're limited essentially to papers. If you've submitted a paper based on the work that you're talking about, they want to know what the paper is. They don't want the paper, they just want the citation. Or if something has changed in terms of your team, have you taken on a new member? Have you moved institutions? Have you lost someone? They want to know that sort of update as well. So then you get study section happens. You get your score a few days later. The first thing a lot of people do is they call up their program officer and say, I got a 35 or something. What does that mean? Or will I get funded? And the standard response will be, I don't know until we see, until we see what the reviews look like. And then we can have some discussions. So that could be about a month. And at that point, then you can have discussions with a program officer and take on board whether you should resubmit, whether you should sit on your hands and wait. They might give you some clue as to whether they think it's fundable, but it will be an educated guess again, because they have to wait till the advisory council makes their decision. That's not to say if you don't get a fantastic score, you're likely to get funded, but you can't guarantee anything until you get a notice of grant award sometime months in the future. So there are two main types of grants that we're looking at here. The first is career development awards, and the second is our research awards. And they differ markedly in one major way. And one is for the career development award, the reviewers are interested in your development as a researcher. So there's an awful lot of this is about your training, your education, and how you will become an independent researcher down the road. Our grants, and we're talking generally here about R01s, R21s, and R03s, they are essentially a cold-hearted hunt for data. They're less interested in your development as a human being. In fact, they're not really interested in your humanity at all, just in your ability to generate data that pushes the field forward. So therefore, they're looking for different things. Your biosketches will reflect this and the like. So for your career development awards, there will be sections where they ask about your motivation, they ask about your plans for the future, and this, that, and the other. These don't really take place in an R grant, where it's, again, it is just, what can you do for us, rather than what can we do for you? So they differ markedly in that respect. And this isn't all the grants by any stretch, but nevertheless, it is some of the major ones, based on where you are in your career path, or in your career trajectory, as to which are the ones you should be looking at. So obviously, as a grad student, there's T32s both for postdocs and pre-docs, if your institute has a suitable T32 training award. There's fellowships, there's diversity fellowships, which are Fs. Obviously, there's an F99, which is a grad student to postdoc transition fellowship, and that's a two-parter that also supports your postdoctoral career. Similar enough to the K99 R00, which is your postdoc to early faculty transition award. So that covers you for the last couple of years of your postdoc and the first 2 to 3 years of your first faculty position. And then, depending on whether you're a researcher, whether you're patient orientated and the like, there's a number of Ks. There's way more applications than this, or way more mechanisms than this. These are just the big ones. And then, of course, when you get into faculty and you have some academic independence, then you can start writing Rs. And we'll look at the 3 big ones in a future slide. So these are some of the Ks. These are not all of them, but they're, as you can see here, they have different goals depending on what stage you're at, depending whether you're clinical or non-clinical and the like. And I'm not really going to talk about all of these. They're there, and there's many of them. There is a site on NIH called the K Kiosk, which goes through all of these and has a lot more information on Ks in general. And these are the early career development awards, the Ts and the Fs. T32 institutional award, obviously a bunch of fellowship awards, which generally provide stipends and the like. Again, I'm not going to go into that. There's plenty of information on the NIH website to cover all of these. So these are the 3 Rs that we talk about. R01 obviously is the bread and butter research grant. These are a very flexible award. I prefer these over any of the others for a number of reasons. This can be anywhere from 2 years to 5 years, depending on the duration of the project that you propose to do. There are different parent announcements, as in announcements for investigator-initiated projects, depending on whether there's a clinical trial involved, whether there isn't one, whether there's some degree of human experimentation. The money for these is very good. It's up to $250,000 a year in direct costs. You can do a modular budget, which is really easy to do. If you go up to $500,000 a year, you have to do a more detailed budget, but it's $500,000 a year. If you go over that, you can, but you need pre-approval before you submit a budget for over $500,000 a year. The R21 is generally devoted towards high-risk, high-reward speculative research. This is a 2-year award. It's $275,000 over 2 years. I find that an awful lot of people look upon an R21 as essentially the first thing they should write when they're writing a grant. There's the impression that it's easier to get because it's a smaller amount of money and the like. It is not. It is none of these things. And you should treat an R21 as what it is, which is a high-risk grant. The difference between an R21 and an R01, or the main difference, is for an R01 is a very risk-averse mechanism. You have to have preliminary data. We used to talk about you had to have half the project done before you even submitted the grant. It's not quite as bad as that, but you nevertheless have to have preliminary data that speaks directly to the feasibility of your award, of your project. Your R21 doesn't need that. Most people do have preliminary data, but you don't need it. The other thing to bear in mind is that the overall success rate for R21s is lower than R01s in general. So the idea that an R01 is, or an R21 is an easier grant to get and it should be your first grant is not based in fact. If I was faced with writing a grant for a 2-year project, I would absolutely write an R01 than over an R21. A, it's easier to get. B, you can ask for more money. And you have more flexibility in terms of what you can do with it, as long as you have preliminary data. They break down into the same basic 3 different types as R01s in terms of clinical trial, clinical research, and non-clinical. And then there's the R03, which is a smaller award. In many ways, this might be considered more of an R01 light than an R21. It's for a specific project. It's 100,000 for 2 years, so it's not a huge amount of money. I helped someone write an application once where their project was to essentially clone and express a gene from Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And that was basically the project. It was a self-contained project. They were going to clone this gene. They were going to express it. They were going to do some characterization on the cloned gene, on the protein that they expressed. The reviewers said this is almost a perfect R03 because it was essentially there. It was a project by itself. The other thing to bear in mind is that neither R21s or R03s are renewable. So they're essentially one-offs. I like to think of R21s as essentially the opening salvo of a larger project to get the high-risk bit out of the way. When I used to write grants for myself, I wrote several R01s where aim 1 was, I am going to mutate this gene, and aims 2 and 3 where I am going to then see what knocking this gene out did to the organism so I can identify the function of this gene. These things died without trace simply because if aim 1 is I'm going to make a mutant, the reviewer will say, well, what if you can't make the mutant? What if it's a lethal mutation? So therefore, that high risk aim 1 killed the entire grant, even if they thought the rest of it was well thought out, because there was a fairly good chance that this project would go nowhere. So thinking of an R21 as the first part, it's a high risk grant. This is what it's designed for, is for this high risk activity. So think in terms of, instead of having a high risk aim 1 for your R01, write an R21 to cover the high risk part, generate the data, and then write your R01 with the data in hand, and essentially taking the risky part out and saying, we've done this work, we've made the mutant, we know it's alive, but it behaves differently than wild type. And now we're going to characterize what this mutant does. So I'd like to think of an R21 as going hand in hand with the R01, but it carries a much higher level of risk, and that's acceptable to NIH. So think in terms of putting these two together. When you write an R21 or an R03, a part of that narrative should be what comes next. You're setting up for something for the next step. And in that case, that would be an R01. So they're very different. They require different things. And if you, for example, if you submitted an R21, I've heard of people getting dinged because reviewers said, why isn't this an R01? You wrote a grant, you had preliminary data, you put it in as an R21 because you thought it was an easier thing to get, and you got dinged for it simply because this would have made more sense as a smaller R01. That's my rant on R21s. So where to find funding? So you have an idea for a grant, or for a project. You say, I need funding for this. This is a perennial question. There are three ways to go about looking for funding, and this is past funding, current funding, and future funding, and they all have their part to play in the look for funding. So the first is past funding. So this is to see who has funded similar work than the work that you're thinking of doing. And why does it matter? Well, firstly, if an agency has funded similar work to yours in the past, there's a good chance that they will continue funding that sort of work. So they're a good place to look. Second is to making sure that someone else already hasn't been funded to do work similar to yours. It may not be always be obvious from your literature searches, but you need to make sure that someone doesn't already have money to do work that has sufficiently overlaps with your own to essentially scupper your chances of getting funded. Maybe you have to shift your stance a little bit to get out from underneath someone else's shadow if they've already been funded for it. Better to know that now than basically go through all the work, submit the grant, and then have it shut down because this is not the least bit original. Also, by looking at to see who has been funded or who has funded work that you're doing, you can identify potential collaborators or potential competitors. They all come to the same trough, and that is funding agencies. That's where they will all show up at some point or another. So it's good to know who's already been funded to do this work. And the best place for this, there are a number of places to find past funding. The £800 gorilla in the room is NIH Reporter. We're talking about, NIH is basically our main funder. So looking at NIH Reporter is the place to go. NIH Report, the website, is a large source of all sorts of funding data and NIH data. Reporter is just one aspect of this. It's a very detailed search engine. You can search by years, by investigator, study section, keywords. If you have a grant number, you can put that in. If any bit of information that you have, you can search on, and the more information you have, the easier it will do to chop it down. I go through this all the time because part of my job is to help people find funded applications that they can take a look at when they're writing their own. So I will just go in here, I'll pick the last 5 years, grant years, and I'll put in Chapel Hill under city and just hit search. Or I might put in R01, and then it pulls up every UNC R01 for the past 5 years. And then I look for people who know me or like me or will be willing to let me have a grant application. But it's a very useful search engine. When you put in your parameters, you will get spat out a report like this, where every single one of these has the information on specific grants. And here you have obviously the usual stuff, the PI, you have some budget information, you have the funding agency, you also have the program officer. So this could be useful. And you also have the study section that reviewed this. So again, if you search by keyword, you can pull up a list of grants that have been funded that are similar enough to your own. You can identify a program officer who might be the first protocol to go, to talk to. And Sam's going to talk more about POs in her module. Or you can identify the study section that reviews grants like this. So that might be a place to start to look for a suitable study section. Current funding. There's a number of places to look for current funding. The first thing I would say is if you, again, rather than thinking about just NIH as a great big blob, think in terms of your specific relevant institutes or centers, bookmark their sites. They all list current funding, future funding, and the like, and their directions. They all have mission statements. Become familiar with your pet ICO, in other words, and know what they're thinking, because ultimately they're the people you want to get money out of. And so whatever you write needs to align with where they see themselves going. How often you should check? Well, it's depending how much time you have. And I would say automate this as much as possible. There are a lot of grants out there. There are a lot of grant announcements out there. You could spend a lot of time looking fruitlessly through non-relevant grant announcements. So anytime you can use the system to automate this, you should. So this is, I'll just go through this bit at a time. First thing, within UNC itself, the Health Sciences Library has funding announcements, they have funding databases and the like. The Office of Postdoctoral Affairs also has lists of funding opportunities, not just from UNC, but they also link to other universities. So you can see, I mean, these are still all NIH opportunities, but other offices of research development and the like from other universities publish their own databases that we can link to. The UNC Office of Research Development, which is a university-wide office, also assists people with grant writing and identifying funding sources. They publish a newsletter monthly called Fundamentals, which is really useful. We'll see a bit more about that. The university also has a subscription to a really large funding database called SPIN. It's run by a company, a grants management company called InfoEd, and they have a database that at any given time contains between 40 and 50,000 grant opportunities, and it's updated in real time. It costs an awful lot of money to subscribe to it. The university picks up the tab. You get to use it for nothing. All you need to do is sign up for a user to get a user profile, which is free. It takes about 24 hours before it comes down, so you get that. They also have an online tutorial. So the search engine is quite complex, and it's to make the most out of this system, it's well worth sitting through the tutorial for an hour and a half. The great thing about SPIN is that it is you can search by location, be it any country in the world, essentially, be it where you are, where the grants are. You can search by keyword, you can search by career stage, be it a pilot, be it grants, be it a proper research grant, career development award. There's any number of parameters, but also you can automate it. So once you have identified search parameters that fit your needs, you can set the system to run automatically. And anytime a grant opportunity pops up that conforms with your search parameters, it will notify you automatically. So this is a case of a few hours at the front end, and essentially this thing scans the worldwide funding landscape and tells you if something that fits your needs or might fit your needs comes up. You can decide whether it is, whether it's suitable or not, but it's a way of getting the system to do your work for you. NIH has an automated system. You can sign up for a newsletter that comes down 3 o'clock every Friday. And this lists funding opportunities across NIH that have come up over the preceding week. It includes notices, notices of future funding opportunities and all sorts of stuff. And again, you just have to log in, put in your email, and you get it, like I said, 3 o'clock every Friday afternoon, it lands. And also there is a link here to a list of active funding announcements. So you can look there as well, although this first one pretty much covers that. So there's a number of ways that you can essentially look at the full breadth of the funding opportunity landscape. And most of these ways you can do it in an automated manner and save yourself time, but still have a real handle on what's being produced. And the SPIN one, which push again here, this covers everything from the big federal players that we know about all the way down to little family foundations and everything in between. So it really covers the full breadth of funding opportunities available to you, automated. So it's actually a really good idea. And as long as the university keeps paying for it, I think more and more people should use it. So this is an example of the page that comes down every Friday. And right here, there are policy notices, general notices, notices of changes to funding opportunities and new funding opportunities and the like. So you can meander through that every Friday. This is the InfoEd SPIN search engine, and this is just one page of it. I mean, like I said, it's highly recommended to do the tutorial, because jumping into SPIN without knowing how to work it is essentially like handing a learner driver the keys to a Ferrari. I mean, they might make it go, but it won't go very well, and it won't be very pretty. So it's worth doing, and there's an awful lot of versatility in how you search. And when you search and it spits out a report, you get something like this. I can't remember what this search is for. I may have spread the net pretty wide on this one, but this covers everything. This is a worldwide search, but it covers everything, including links to the actual opportunity, the sponsor, the amount of money involved, and deadlines. Future funding. So why do we care about future funding? Well, the main thing is if you get a grant opportunity and it tells you that the deadline is in 2 months from now or 3 months from now, A, you have to write the grant, but B, you also have to present a credible plan of what you're going to do. So it would be far better if you knew ahead of time that there was a grant opportunity coming down the pike, so you could think in terms of coming up with ideas. You could think in terms of putting a team together so that you can have a credible looking team when you write your grant application. And there are a number of ways that you can actually scan the horizon before a grant opportunity lands. The first one is a request for information. And this is the longer term, slightly vaguer one, but this is where ICOs are looking for information on a particular research area, which suggests that they are prepping for a funding opportunity or a funding opportunity announcement. They want to know more about what people are thinking about a particular topic, and this will inform how they then approach that. The second is more definite, which is a notice of intent to publish. And this is literally that. And this comes in the Friday afternoon email. And this tells you we are going to put out a funding announcement in the next couple of months that will cover this. So they're basically giving you the heads up that this is coming down the pike. Start gearing up now in terms of thinking of a research plan, thinking in terms of, do you want to spend some time generating some preliminary data? Do you want to think in terms of identifying collaborators and the like? Or, I was thinking about writing a paper on something. Let's get it written so we can then cite it in our grant application. So it's giving you a heads up. And the last one is what are called cleared concepts. And these are ideas for future funding opportunities. And this is one of the things that the Institute advisory councils talk about when they meet 3 times a year. What happens is a program officer will come up with an idea for a research direction, for a funding opportunity. They write what's called a concept. They present this to the advisory council and they say, we think that human genome sequencing and personalized medicine is the thing of the future. We'd like to put out a funding opportunity for advanced techniques in genome analysis, something like that. And the advisory council will decide, yes, this sounds like a great idea. It's something we should do based on the current climate. Now we just have to find the money to do it. So that's always the next step. But at least if they approve the concept, they clear it, in other words, then this now becomes a potential topic for a future funding announcement. And these are all published because the advisory council is a government-funded body. So therefore, the minutes of their meetings are available to the public. Not always easy to find. So, but generally on any institute or center website, you can, if you hunt around, you can find the minutes for their advisory council meetings, which will include the cleared concepts. So this is a description of a concept that was presented, they approved, and so it's a good indication that sometime in the near future there will be a funding opportunity on that topic. So again, it's time to start thinking about, if they're going to fund this, is there anything I can be doing now that improves my chances of putting in a credible application down the road? A number of institutes and centers, I've listed some of them here, they make it pretty obvious where their cleared concepts are, so they're easy. Some of them are harder to find. Again, the Office of Research Development Fundamentals newsletter, they do a lot of the searching for you, so they publish the cleared concepts as they come in as well. So that's also a good place to look. So these are all ways that you can essentially keep an eye on the funding landscape before it actually is officially released, and gear up for writing competitive grant applications. This is another page from the Friday afternoon newsletter. Again, they're talking here about grants that are coming down the pike. There's also a whole long list of funding announcements, funding opportunities. So there's an awful lot in there. And for the sake of putting in your email onto an NIH website, this lands on your doorstep every week. So the types of funding announcements that we're talking about, the first one is the parent announcement. And this might be old hat for some people, but for some of you, it's important to know the distinction. The first is the notice of special interest. So this is essentially NIH saying, or an institute or a group of institutes saying, we're interested in a particular research direction, and there's links to a bunch of relevant specific funding opportunities. So that's always a good place to look for a start, because that covers multiple institutes, all with a common research interest. The parent announcement is the standard investigator-initiated announcement. If you're writing a grant, if you have an idea for a project, you want to write an R01 and send it in, you have to be responding to an actual funding announcement. You can't just send it in. It has to be going to a place. So every 3 years, they publish, the NIH releases a parent announcement for investigator-initiated awards, R01s, all the way down the line. And so if you just had an idea for a project, that's what you would respond to. So you would look up whatever the current parent announcement is for that specific grant application. And remember, part of your consideration will be, what grant mechanism should I apply for? Is there a clinical trial involved? Is it a 2-year project? Is it a 4-year project? How much money do I think I'll need? These will, how many preliminary data do I have? These will all factor into what sort of project, what sort of grant mechanism you're applying for. Then there are program announcements. These are generally these are projects that are or announcements that are directed towards a broad research area. There is no money set aside. They use standard deadlines. Again, these are early February, early June, early October. They have standard standing study sections. So this would be your standard. We're interested in cancer. Very broad, but they'd like to see what you have to. They're interested in seeing what you have. There is a PAR. This again is a program announcement. We're interested in a broad topic, but we have specific review criteria. So in this case, it's worth checking to see how this differs from a standard program announcement, because there's something they're looking for more than just a regular application. So you need to check and see what they're looking for. They may have specific deadlines, and we'll look at a funding announcement in a minute. And then there's RFAs, or requests for applications. These are much more focused. They have a specific area. We're interested in radiological diagnosis techniques for lung cancer. So they're very highly focused. They usually have set aside funds. They have a special emphasis panel. So there might be a single deadline for this, and they convene a review study section specifically for this project. And the great thing about RFAs is that if the work that you're proposing to do aligns with the goals of that RFA, then your chances of funding are significantly higher than if you just write a grant into a program announcement. But you have to be, the work you're proposing has to actually align with the RFA. So it's always worth looking out for RFAs. They are the best bet for getting funded if what you're proposing aligns well with what they're asking for. So they're the 3 main types: program announcements, parent announcements, various types of program announcements, and RFAs. And they all essentially differ by how focused the topic matter they're looking for. So you look through all this stuff and you find a funding announcement and it spits out a number, and it looks something like this. And well, what does all this mean? Well, first set of numbers is type of grant it is. Program announcement, RFA, PAR, could be a PAS, PAS, I think, is set aside funding. There may or may not be a single institute. So in this case, it's the human development. If multiple institutes get together with a common interest and they co-publish a funding announcement, there won't be a number here or a letter of code here. This is only if this is limited to a specific institute. This is the year. This is important simply because most funding announcements have a shelf life. If this number is too far in the past, the chances are there's a newer one out there. So make sure that the funding opportunity you're looking at is the current one. For most parent announcements last 3 years. So if we're in 25 and we're looking at a 21 funding announcement, the chances are this one has expired. So you need to double check that. And then this is just a unique identifier. It's the 347 that came out that year. So an actual funding announcement, this is very much like the 30-page contract you get with your cell phone. Everyone gets it, no one reads it. And this is somewhat the same. They're generally quite long and quite wordy, but they're also well worth reading because they contain critical information. You're writing a grant application, you're asking for money. You need to know what they're looking for in exchange. So the first thing to check is what institutes or centers are actually sponsoring this funding announcement. So for example, if you're writing a cancer-related grant and NCI doesn't appear in this list, could be problematic. So double check that, because at the end of the day, regardless of what you write, your grant will go to one of these institutes or centers to be reviewed. Is it the right mechanism? Again, we've talked about this. Is it, are you looking at high risk? So an R21 might be worthwhile. Are you proposing some sort of clinical trial or some sort of human subject research? Make sure that you're covered there and that this is an appropriate mechanism for that. Double check the related notices. Remember, a funding announcement could come out at one time and the deadline could be 4 months in the future. Lots of things can change in that time. So therefore, if you've decided you're writing a grant in response to a specific funding announcement, go back to it. I would say every couple of weeks. Bookmark it. Don't download a PDF and think that's it. You're covered, which is what I used to do, and it's got bitten by that several times. Go back to the live funding announcement and make sure nothing new has changed. Be it they've added new requirements, they've changed the deadline, they've done something. Make sure that what you're reading, that the information you're reading is the most current, because it does change over time. Check the dates. Obviously, you need to know both when the deadlines are, when the expiry date of this funding mechanism is. That's crucial information. Read through the topics. Make sure that this is the most boring part of it, but read it all and make sure that this is exactly what you're looking for. Years ago, I worked with someone. This is before they had different varieties of R01s, where you had a clinical trial and you had a non-clinical trial. And I was working with a guy on a grant, and we had the thing essentially written, and we decided to go back and read the fine print. And buried in all of this was a single sentence that says, this grant opportunity does not support clinical trials. We essentially blew us out of the water, because his clinical trial-based application was now dead. And we'd written it, and because we hadn't read the fine print right up front. So it's important to read all of it, because this is where the information, this is what they're looking for. It also helps because you might want to give them some back, give them some of their own information back. If you're writing justification, you might want to use their own prose. So it's important to be familiar with this. In this case, in this funding announcement, this is a multiple institution center funding announcement. So down here we have topics that are of particular interest to each participating institute or center. So make sure that if this is a multi-institute funding opportunity, make sure that you're responding to the topics that are of interest to your particular institute or center. Are you eligible for this? If this is a limited submission, there might only be one submission allowed per institute, per institution like UNC. Generally, when these come down the pike, the Office of Research Development takes over, and they will run an internal submission competition to identify which application the university will support. If they submit two, they'll both be rejected. So they essentially help identify the one that is most likely to be funded. So the one that has the most compelling argument, but they have a process. They generally, when a limited one comes down the pike, they generally announce it. But it's always worth checking, is your institute eligible? A lot of grants are only available to institutions that have a certain cap in terms of their overall funding. So you need to make sure that we're not in that situation. You need to make sure that it's not limited to a specific career phase, in which case you may or may not be eligible. So just make sure that both you and your institute are eligible to apply for this award. The review criteria. Again, for standard R01s, R21s, this is boilerplate. It's worth reading, but it's standard stuff. However, if this isn't a standard program announcement or parent announcement, go through the review criteria, because these are what the reviewers will be using to evaluate your award, your application. Make sure that whatever you're writing conforms with what they're supposed to be looking for. And and then in terms of talking to people, remember I said that it's the program officers who write these. They're also the scientific contact. And Sam's going to talk more about how you go about contacting POs and the like. But their contact information is here. If you have a question with regard to eligibility or anything else, or suitability of the topic matter, the program officer listed here under the scientific contacts is the person to talk to. It's their job to take your phone call or your email, so that's what they're there for. And in this case, because there are multiple ICs involved, there are multiple program officers. You pick your program officer that is most relevant to your pet institute or center. And that's where I'm going to stop. I have no idea about the time. Okay, I went an hour.
Yeah, David, it's 2:04. Just as a quick time check, do we have time for one question that's in the chat?
We do. I'll yes.
Okay, I will read the question, and I actually have some thoughts on this myself, but
I'm going to stop sharing now.
If you have not completed a postdoc, would you recommend starting with an F32 or jumping into a K01, or would it be dependent on where you are employed?
Where you're employed? What meaning what?
Well, do you want me to answer it really quickly?
Yes.
And then you can either say you agree or disagree.
Yes.
So this person doesn't say where they are in their postdoc, but an F32 is really meant for the beginning of a postdoc. So if you're just transitioning from graduate student to postdoc, F32 is probably going to be your best bet. K01 is typically applied for after you've been in a postdoc for a couple of years and you're shifting to an independent research career. So they are looking for something different between the two of those. And then in terms of where you're employed, I always think it's important to understand like the policies of the departments and what they're willing to support, right?
Okay. Yes.
For your application, but I think that's less important than where you are in your research career.
I will go with that answer. Sounds great.
Alicia, is there anything you want to add to that?
I mean, if you skip the postdoc altogether, then okay. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if the likelihood of, if you haven't had any kind of postdoc or previous like grant funding outside of like private institute kind of funding, how that would look if you needed to kind of go back and start with like a F32 and write yourself a postdoc. But yeah, I guess that was kind of.
I think a postdoc is a standard sort of stage in the trajectory, but I don't think it's an absolute requirement if you can make the case.
Thank you.
Uh,
Maybe before we shift to Samantha, does anyone else have a question?
nope. Okay. Moving right along.
Can everybody see my screen? Okay.
You're on presenter mode.
Yeah, how about now?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. I may skip ahead a little just so we can still finish on time. I did design these slides to be a reference at the end of the day because I know this is a lot of information to retain in just an hour and a half. So keep that in mind, and please, yes, stop and ask any questions that you may have. So as David has been talking about, more of a macro view of the NIH grant system, like what the types of mechanisms look like, what happens once you press the submit button, how they're reviewed, et cetera. And I'm going to take a more micro look at the individual components. So again, we're probably not going to get through all of this today, but I do want to give a high level overview of the difference between what you might be used to in the form of manuscript writing versus grant writing, because they are quite different in the way you should approach it. And then a breakdown of some of the key sections that are parts of most grant mechanisms. Now, this isn't a comprehensive list, but a pretty good idea that these components are typically involved in most grants from NIH. And then a timeline sort of, okay, great, these are all the components, but how do I get started? And, how far in advance, what the lead time kind of looks like, and what you should do at each step of the way. So I'm going to kind of skip through some of this just to save some time. But basically, the essential questions you want to address in a grant is, should the research be done? Are you addressing a public health impact? Are you addressing a gap in the field? Can it be done? So is what you're proposing a feasible way of approaching it? And is the team strong? Do you have the experience and the resources to complete the grant projects successfully? And one way to appease reviewers would be to just put yourself in their position. So most of these folks, as David had mentioned, are faculty, they have day jobs. So this is something that they sort of volunteer their time for. So after their day job, they're reading these grants and evaluating them, and then sitting at study section to discuss them as a group. So you should be prepared to write your grant in the sense that nobody's ever looked at this project before, so it should be detailed, comprehensive. You should be able to build out a roadmap that can lead the reviewer to understand points A and B. Just make it really easy for the reader, and don't leave anything to the imagination. Don't, if it's not written down on the page, they're not going to try and infer anything from that. So that's very, very important to know. So even though you may think it's obvious, do state it. And one valuable advice I can give is give your grant to as many people as possible with varying expertise, not just your own, because they can shed light on gaps and holes that they can see that likely a reviewer will point out as well. So again, keep it simple, try to avoid using complex sentences and jargon. If you can, incorporate figures that can help break up the big blocks of text. These are, and can be, depending on the grant mechanism, quite large and cumbersome to get through. So again, making it as easy as possible. Reviewers never complain that an application was just too easy to follow. So sorry if I'm jumping ahead. Again, please shout out if you have a question. So I did want to draw parallels between writing a grant and writing a paper. So a grant focuses more on what you will do rather than what you've already done. And, showing that you can feasibly complete the project is what's critical in a grant, whereas in a scientific manuscript, you've already completed the work. So you're not really trying to convince the reader that what you're trying to do is feasible. For a grant, there's not an easy way of knowing who's going to be sitting on your review panel. Then again, David had mentioned that you can sort of select a study section based on expertise, and they do have rosters where you can see who sits on that study section typically, but again, there's no way of knowing who's going to be assigned your grant. So keeping, the reviewers are going to have a general scientific literacy, but they may not be experts in your field. So writing in such a way that is compelling for them will make it strong. Whereas a manuscript, it's going to a specific journal with a specialized audience, you know who you're writing for. Again, grant proposal, kind of just want to get to the point and sell. It's like a business proposal. You want to get your thoughts and ideas out there, and again, show it in such a way that it's compelling to the reviewer that you can complete it and complete it successfully. Whereas a scientific manuscript, you're providing accounts of methods and findings that you've already completed. Again, grant proposals are emphasizing the selling potential of the work, whereas you're kind of wrapping up with a nice little bow, your manuscript of work already completed. And again, you want to be enthusiastic, you want to show excitement for a grant proposal, whereas a scientific manuscript maybe is kind of just relaying the facts. Obviously, you're excited about your findings, but it's more general in tone. And then for a grant proposal, again, keeping it simple is better. So fewer words, less complex sentence structure is better. And then for a scientific manuscript, I guess it can go either way, but it's not as problematic when it comes to structuring it. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. So as I mentioned before, this is not a full and comprehensive list. However, it does have a pretty strong overview of the main components of a grant from NIH. Specific aims page, which I'm going to probably spend the majority of my time discussing, is probably the most important aspect of the grant. The research strategy. So specific aims page is essentially a one-page overview of what your proposal is going to be about. If a reviewer is going to read anything, it will be that page. So you're probably going to spend a majority of your time on that, at least in the beginning and at the end. The research strategy is the research plan. So you're going to talk about the field, the gaps, how you plan to address them. Bio sketches, that's like your CV, but in NIH format, and I'll get into that in more detail. And then long list of supporting documents, and again, I've listed a few here. So without further ado. So as I mentioned, the specific aims page is probably the most critical piece of an NIH application. It's meant to grab the reader's attention. It's meant to be a summary, gives you a high-level overview of, again, the significance of the what you're planning to do, the impact it will create in the field. It's one easy-to-read page. So again, even though you're assigned a few reviewers, or your application is assigned to a few reviewers, everybody in the room, a study section, is going to read this page. It's, again, the first document you should begin writing, and it's the last document you should tidy up at the end. And David had mentioned that I was going to highlight contacting program officers. We highly, highly, highly recommend that you draft a specific aims page to begin the grant writing process. And if you start early enough, which we advise, reaching out to program officers at NIH and sending them this page is a really good thing to help initiate the conversation, because you kind of have a outline of what your plan is and they can provide feedback. Now, they're not going to tell you what to do, but they could kind of guide you to say, like, yes, this really aligns with what we're looking for, or maybe not, and maybe you should consider this grant mechanism instead. Because program officers are actually the ones that are writing the solicitations. And so they know what they're looking for as far as projects. And so this is one good way of, again, kind of giving them a summary, getting a jumping off point for the discussion. And we highly recommend incorporating that into your grant prep. So on the right, I kind of broke down. So it's a one-pager. So I kind of think about it in this way. So I blocked it off. So you kind of open with the problem, providing some context, the solution you're proposing, the aims. So this is the goals of your research proposal. And then what is this large splashy impact? How does it address that gap that you mentioned earlier in the page? So I'm gonna kind of break it down a bit. So, sorry. Yeah, so I'm going to give some examples because, I feel like that's the most useful way to view these things. So, for example, for the context of problem statements, so this is probably going to be your first paragraph. So this is an example of one that's been funded. So basically, as I mentioned, yellow is the hook. So, youth sports injuries account for $33 billion in healthcare costs and 20 million lost school days annually. Like, you told me what the problem is, I'm hooked. Like, look, you want to read on. So then the green is highlighting what is the current knowledge in the field. So like, of these injuries, concussions stand out, and they're kind of setting up what that current knowledge is. And then in blue, it's what the gap is, what is still lacking. So despite this, gaps in information sharing and shared decision-making at initial and follow-up care points have prevented meaningful changes in care models. And then the last is saying what the critical need is. There is a critical need for support tools to enhance patient and clinician. So it reads pretty formulaic, I suppose, if you want to think about it that way, but these are like the critical pieces of information that reviewers are going to be looking for. And you only have one page to do it, so making sure you can fit this in is super important. So this is the context and problem. The next part of the specific aims page is the solution and objective. So you just propose the problem. Next, you need to propose what that solution would be. This is another way you can start introducing parts of your team, explain why your team is uniquely equipped to succeed in solving this problem. Also, a way to kind of put a plug in of how your goals match the NIH or the institute or center's mission. And then you can also start plugging in if you have preliminary data or preliminary finding, you could put that here as well. I don't have an example of that per se, but for the specific aims, you usually define this in 2 or 3 focused aims. They are independent, so that means that one aim shouldn't hinge on the success of another. So, for example, in order to do aim 2 or 3, aim 1 has to work. They want them to be independent aims. And the way we structure these are to state what the objective is, tell them what the approach is, and then state any sort of deliverables that you would deliver. So again, this seems pretty abstract without an example to kind of visualize this. So here, example 1, you have the specific aim 1 with the title. So conduct enhanced epidemiological surveillance across the spectrum of transmission intensity and disease severity. So they're stating, what the objective is. And then they present their approach and then what the deliverables would be. So these activities will allow us to select sites at variable levels, etc. So that's one example. And then specific aim 2, again, to determine and compare the urine metabolite profiles of children with viral and bacterial cap with those of healthy children. So they say what they're setting out to do, and then green is sort of taking a stab at what the approach would be. Hope that makes sense. And then you wrap up the specific aims page with your conclusions and impacts. So don't neglect this section. I know you're going to say like, I'm really short on space, so I'm just going to skip this, but this is something that really puts everything back into perspective for the reader. Because again, leaving up to imagination, the reviewer doesn't have time for that. They're going to want it kind of said explicitly to them. So having addressed these specific aims, this is what the outcome would be. This is what the future directions would be, and this is the impact that it's going to cause on the field by addressing that gap. So linking the gap from the opening paragraph to what you now would have filled in with the specific aims. And it's also the final takeaway for the reader. So here's an example of the conclusions and impact. So you're saying this work will establish the feasibility and preliminary efficacy of our software tool in the concussion care workflow. Future work will include clinical studies to support enhanced shared decision-making and patient outcomes in concussion care, and then diverging fundamentally from this prevailing care model and significantly advancing personalized effective concussion treatment strategies from the initial point of care. So this kind of gives you a walkthrough. I know I kind of breezed through it, but I believe Beverly's going to share these slides with you, so you do have them to refer back to. And I think it will be helpful when you do begin grant writing to kind of see how you can fit your project kind of into this formula. But I hope I've given you some good examples. I'll go ahead and skip through that. So Again, the specific aims, the grant writing process starts here. It also ends here. Most reviewers will only read this page, so making sure you can make a compelling case why you deserve funding in a single pager will be a really strong skill to build. And then you ensure that all other sections, the supporting documents, the research plan, etc., will mirror this document. And that's why you kind of initiate the grant writing process with it and then make edits to it at the end so it matches and parallels everything else. So the research strategy is basically your rationale, your logical plan of how you plan to address this problem. And it's often, like I said, broken into those independent 2 or 3 aims. And the main things you want to drive home is the significance of the work, how innovative it is, and what your approach is. And your approach should also include common pitfalls and why, and like alternative approaches, because they want to know that you have a plan in place in case something doesn't work out on the first try. And obviously with those alternative approaches, don't make them a stronger way of approaching the problem than the original one. Do state what the gaps would be if you were to choose a alternative approach, but just knowing you have a plan in place to make the work feasible is really, really important. And again, I know we're running on time, I'm short on time, but basically this is how the research strategy should be structured. Again, highlighting why your research matters in the significance section, what makes your research unique, how are you approaching it differently than something that somebody else has done before, and how will you accomplish those aims? So addressing study design, methods, how you plan to analyze the data, etc. And then I have some more bits, like I said, don't expect you to retain this, but to use as a reference later. Fellowship applications, like David mentioned, like F30s, F31, F32, those research strategies are up to 6 pages. Smaller grants, like those high-risk, high-reward R21s, are also up to 6 pages, whereas larger grants that are going to expect you to have pretty extensive preliminary data and a pretty solid foundation will have a research strategy of up to 12 pages. David had mentioned biosketches, and I mentioned it in the intro, but biosketches are essentially your CV. And as David mentioned, it holds different weight depending on the mechanism you're applying for. They're going to hold more weight on early stage investigator or fellowship applications. They actually have an additional section for scholastic performance where you actually include your academic like coursework and such. But this is the general format. It's typically 5 pages or less. You have a personal statement section that states how your expertise is relevant to the project and your role. The second section will be your key roles and recognition. So your accomplishment, like your, I guess like offices that you've held or any appointments. And then contributions to science is a little tricky one, but essentially how you've already contributed to the field. And that's usually backed up by a handful of accomplishments, whether that be a conference abstract or a publication, something of that nature. And then there's a pretty lengthy list of supporting documents that you'll need to include. You'll need to include an abstract, which is 30 lines or less, project narrative, which is a couple of sentences. These provide an overview of your project. The 2 to 3 sentences is more for the layman, explaining the public health relevance, whereas the abstract is more typical, what you've seen probably for a conference, but a little bit more detailed. It will include the research objectives, the aims, methods, and the significance. I put an asterisk next to these because you shouldn't include any proprietary or confidential information or any details of past accomplishments, because if your grant is funded, this will be in the public domain. So when you go onto NIH Reporter, like David had showed you, this will be public information. So you wouldn't want to put anything confidential there. Budget justification, so explaining why you need the funds that you're requesting, is a document your facilities and equipment, data management and sharing, letters of support, all of these, and then if relevant, vertebrate animals, human subjects. So these are your supporting documents, and I've kind of given like a brief overview. Again, not an extensive list. It does depend on the mechanism and the solicitation, so be sure to look into those in great detail and make a project checklist for yourself as far as what sections will be included in your grant application. And then I went ahead and drafted out a grant proposal timeline. Again, it's rough. It depends on your bandwidth, of course, but just a general idea. We like to think that you probably get started about a year in advance, at least from the developing the idea stage, reading the literature, validating your approach, maybe finding collaborators, searching for funding sources, that kind of thing. And then about 8 months, you'll begin drafting that specific aims page, reviewing that solicitation, creating your project checklist, getting colleagues to give you feedback on your aims page. Once you've revised it and you're happy with it, maybe consulting a program officer to get feedback and see if it aligns with what you're looking to submit for. Because, you know, you want that feedback early on so you can incorporate it and make the most competitive grant application possible. And then give yourself about 6 months to write the grant itself. Again, I didn't give you an extensive list, but this is the meat of the proposal, usually the specific aims page, the research strategy, and those supporting documents. So developing those sections slowly with constant feedback from your team, or even resources like tracks can give you feedback. Assembling letters of support, so reaching out to people, engaging OSP, the Office of Sponsored Programs here at UNC. You should notify them saying, hey, I'm looking to submit a grant proposal, so they know it's coming. And just setting deadlines for yourself a couple months before the deadline, just to make sure you're staying on track as far as getting feedback and revisions and getting your application submission ready. Sorry, I really blew through that, but some of the key takeaways is just start early, give yourself enough time. You don't know what unexpected challenges will come your way or any setbacks, so it won't hurt to start a little bit early. Keep it simple, make your ideas easy for everyone to understand. Again, I advise you not only to just give it to as many people who are willing to read it to give feedback, but definitely ask people who aren't in your field, because I feel like that gives you even like more useful information, because you take a lot of the knowledge you have about your field of interest for granted, and knowing where you can fill in those gaps will be important. And then highlight your team skills and readiness to tackle the work, and again, use feedback to identify any blind spots. I have Q&A, and then I have a tab full of resources. So basically, Trackstar was something that David had mentioned. We have a database of NC faculty who have very generously given us their grant applications to use for folks like you who would want to see an example. NIAID, so the Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, has a repository full of funded NIH applications from various grant mechanisms. NCI, the Cancer Institute, that has the same. There's opportunities to even sit or audit review committees, so you can see how grants are reviewed. And then obviously us at NC Tracks, we're happy to help in all aspects of the grant prep proposal writing process. And there's books, of course, that you can, other resources. The Institute has other resources. And then just general, again, review this at your leisure, but I have just general advice on writing essentials, and again, just prompts, like to kind of get the juices flowing as far as like, oh, well, what does a significant section look like? Just prompts to get those ideas and significance, innovation, and approach for the research strategy. So again, sorry that was a lot in a short amount of time, but I'm happy to address any questions with whatever remaining time we have, and I hope that you guys get these slides to review to help prepare you. So.
Wow, that was great. Thank you both. Lots of information. And yes, we will definitely share the slides. Looking at the chat, any questions coming up? While people are thinking, I'll throw out a couple things you guys can either confirm or deny. One is that the program officer is your friend. It's in their interest to have a good portfolio of grants, and they will not be reviewing the proposal. So it's okay if you feel like your ideas are not fully formed when you approach them. So approaching them early is good. And they can be helpful after you get the summary statement. If something is clearly an error, further explanation. If you can give them some talking points when they go to the council, they can sometimes defend your proposal there. I've had that happen a couple of times.
Yeah.
The other thing is the program officer, if you send your Ames page into a PO and it's not really what they're interested in, they also may be able to tell you who would be interested in it, because I mean they're the people on the inside, so to speak. So
they're the ones writing the solicitation at the end of the day. So if yours isn't in a good alignment with the one, or your application or project may not be in a solid alignment with the solicitation you originally went to talk to them for, they're so nice in the sense that they'll say, well, actually, this person has a solicitation that may align better, and they can point you in the right direction. I've had that happen.
I wanted to drop one additional resource in the chat, and I have talked about this for years, and I don't know that people are actually paying attention to it, but NIH has a podcast called All About Grants. And the production value used to be pretty low. I think it's getting better, but they're pretty short. You can listen to it while you're driving or while you're cleaning. And what I've dropped in the link is specifically for advice for new and early career scientists. There's changes coming down for the fellowships. There's changes coming down for the biosketch. There's lots of stuff happening right now. If you want advice from people at NIH and what they're looking for in these fellowship and K awards, listen to the podcast. It's a little boring, but multitask. It has some really valuable information. So anyway, I've dropped that in.
Great. Grant stuff isn't boring. What are you on about?
I mean, it's riveting.
I was going to say, I wouldn't call people.
I tried.
Well, it looks like anybody else questions that you haven't put in the chat? Are you guys hearing me? I think I'm frozen, but somehow.
We can hear you.
We can hear you,
but I can't look at the chat. Nothing is moving. So
parental funding, yes. So I just bear in mind that the NC Tracks Proposal Development Service is available to work with you one-on-one. If you have an idea for a grant application, you want to kick it around, we'll do that. We will work with you if you have a draft and you want some feedback on it, and we're willing to work with you on that and on multiple drafts. We're not like a one and done service, so feel free to contact Proposal Development and make use of us. We've worked on God knows how many NIH applications at this stage.
This is our shameless plug.
Yes.
Is that a free service to UNC employees, or how does that work?
Well, right now, it is, yes,
Right this very minute.
2:34. Right now it is. Our leadership is making noises about instituting chargeback for all services. It hasn't happened to us yet. So right now, but I can't guarantee that's the way it's always going to be, unfortunately. And I don't like it, but it is how it is.
Sure.
Okay. So
act fast.
Act fast. And to be honest, I'm not sure how they would ever implement a chargeback for proposed development. So I don't know what's going to happen with that. But right as of now, yes, we're a free service.
Could send a box of dark chocolate in appreciation.
I'm sure my leadership will appreciate that. They can put it in their bank account. I don't know. Anyway, who knows? It's turbulent times. So yeah, but if you have any questions, or if you want to look at grant applications of mechanisms, funded applications, Sam listed a bunch of sources there, but Trackstar also has a bunch from UNC investigators. So you don't be in my situation, as in, what does an R01 look like when I start writing an R01, having never seen one. So at least you can see how other people invented the wheel before you start inventing your own.
Right. David and Samantha, thank you so much. We know this was a big task to push out a lot of information and resources to us in a nice, neat package, and we appreciate all you did to provide that for everyone today. As mentioned, we will provide a link to this session, and then we'll also send out the slides. If David and Samantha, if you'll send those to me, we'll make sure we get that out to all the participants. And then we'll also send you a link. We'd like to hear your feedback about this session and what else you might find beneficial for the future for trainings. So thanks, everyone. Stay safe in your travels in the
Thank you
next
all.
couple of days. Thank you.
For having